"You're a stain on this court and frankly a burden to the taxpayers," Judge Bradford barked, his finger trembling as he pointed it from his high perch. He didn't just see a woman in a tailored navy suit, he saw an easy target to crush under the weight of his ego. He thought he could bury her with a $5,000 contempt fine for simply demanding he follow the law. What he didn't know was that the woman maintaining a preternatural calm below him was the newly elected leader of the entire State Bar Association. The very woman who held the keys to his professional cage. This wasn't just another morning on the docket, it was the day the predator finally became the prey. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of floor wax and the palpable shock of the gallery. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where justice usually moved with the agonizing slowness of drying paint. Judge Bradford sat high upon his bench, his black robes billowing around him like a dark, suffocating cloud. He was a man who enjoyed his honorable title a little too much, viewing the courtroom not as a hall of law, but as his own private kingdom. At the defense table, Karla Reed stood with an upright, unbothered posture. She wasn't there as a high-priced corporate fixer, she was there providing pro bono support for a single mother facing a predatory eviction. Bradford hadn't even bothered to look at the nameplate on her desk. He was too busy looking at his watch, his face flushed with a desperate, explosive rage. "Miss Reed, or whatever your name is," Bradford sneered, not even glancing at the file. "This motion is frivolous. Your client hasn't paid rent in months, and I won't have you wasting my time with hardship excuses. The law in this room is clear because I am the one who dictates it." The gavel strike was not a sound of order, it was the sharp, violent crack of a king asserting his dominance over a peasant. Judge Bradford leaned so far over the mahogany bench that Karla could smell the peppermint he used to mask the scent of his third cup of coffee. $5,000, Ms. Reed, he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, predatory hiss that carried to the very last row of the gallery. "Payable to the clerk of this court before the close of business. And if you so much as breathe another syllable of interlocutory appeal, I will have the bailiff escort you to a cell where the Supreme Court's precedents can't hear you scream." The gallery was a tableau of frozen horror. Cassie Reed, the young mother standing beside Karla, let out a small, choked sob that broke the silence of the room. She looked at Karla, her eyes wide with the realization that her last line of defense was being dismantled by a man who treated the law like a retail transaction. The diverse crowd in the pews, veterans, laborers, and tired parents, watched with agape mouths, their hands pressed to their faces as they witnessed the executioner's axe of Bradford's authority fall on the elegant woman in the navy suit. But Karla Reed did not flinch. She did not beg for leniency, nor did she show the flicker of fear that Bradford clearly craved. Instead, she maintained her preternatural calm, her posture upright and unbothered. A slight, knowing smirk played at the corner of her lips, an expression that, for a split second, made the flushed rage on Bradford's face falter into a shadow of confusion. "I understand your ruling perfectly, Your Honor," Karla said, her voice echoing with a terrifyingly clinical clarity. She didn't look at the bailiff who was stepping toward her. Instead, she reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a small, gold-embossed card. She didn't hand it to the officer, she held it up with a slow, deliberate motion, ensuring it was positioned exactly where the court reporter, Beverly, could see it through her spectacles. "I will pay the fine," Karla continued, her eyes locking onto Bradford's with the steady gaze of a hunter who had already tripped the snare. "But I would strongly suggest you keep the receipt. You are going to need it when the Judicial Qualifications Commission asks for your side of the story regarding your comments on my intellectual capacity." Bradford let out a harsh, grating laugh that sounded like dry gravel. "The commission? I am the law in this county, Ms. Reed. Get her out of my sight." Karla didn't wait for the bailiff to touch her. She turned her head slightly toward the court reporter. "Beverly, ensure you get every word of that last exchange on the record." I want the full, unedited transcript on my desk by 2 p.m. Beverly, a woman who had worked in this courthouse for 20 years and seen every bully pass through its doors, looked at the card in Karla's hand. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a sudden, electric surge of excitement. "Yes, President Reed," she whispered. The courtroom went dead silent. The title hung in the air like a guillotine blade, heavy and sharp. Bradford froze, his gavel halfway to the block for the next case on his crowded docket. The explosive red flush in his cheeks began to fade, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. What did you just call her?" he whispered, his voice cracking as he looked down at the woman he had just labeled a burden to the taxpayers. Karla Reed didn't answer. She didn't have to. She adjusted her blazer with a single, sharp movement, turned her back on the bench, and began to walk toward the heavy oak doors. The rhythmic click of her heels against the marble floor was the only sound in the room, sounding very much like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. She led the sobbing Cassie Reed out of the lion's den, leaving behind a judge who was only just beginning to realize that he had brought a gavel to a nuclear strike. The war had started, and the predator had officially become the prey. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B swung shut behind Karla, but the silence she left in her wake was more deafening than any shout. Inside the courtroom, the air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Judge Bradford remained frozen, his hands still hovering over the gavel, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the elegant woman in navy had just stood. The term, President Reed, echoed in his mind, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the sudden, frantic beat of his heart. He looked toward Beverly, the court reporter. Usually, she was a fixture of the room as invisible as the wood grain of the benches, but now she was sitting up straighter, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine like a pianist preparing for a concerto. "Beverly," Bradford began, his voice sounding thin and reedy, stripped of its usual judicial thunder. "Clear the record of the last 3 minutes. Technical error. We'll restart the contempt hearing." Beverly didn't even look up. "The record is live, Your Honor. And per the State Bar's standing protocol for judicial oversight, this transcript has already been uploaded to the secure cloud server. I couldn't delete it if I wanted to." A cold sweat broke out along Bradford's hairline. The intellectual capacity comment. He had said it. He had looked at the chairperson of the Judicial Oversight Committee, the woman who literally wrote the handbook on bench ethics, and told her she lacked the brainpower to understand his court. He had called her a burden to taxpayers. He had threatened her with a cell for quoting the Supreme Court. Every word was now a digital fingerprint, a permanent stain on a record that could no longer be scrubbed clean by his bailiff or his influence. Back in the hallway, Karla walked with a purposeful stride, her heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm against the marble. Cassie Reed hurried beside her, clutching her purse to her chest, her face a mask of bewilderment. "Ms. Reed." "Karla. I don't understand. What just happened?" He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Karla stopped near a tall arched window where the morning sun cut through the dust motes. She turned to Cassie, her expression softening but her eyes remaining like flint. "He didn't see a ghost, Cassie. He saw the end of his career. Men like Bradford rely on the dark. They rely on the fact that the people they bully don't have the standing to be heard. But today, he bullied the one person whose job it is to listen." Karla pulled out her phone and sent a single, encrypted text message. "The fish is on the hook. Move to phase 2. What happens now?" Cassie whispered. "Now," Karla said, looking back at the courtroom doors as a group of stunned lawyers began to trickle out, whispering frantically. "We let him stew in his own words. A man like Bradford, when he realizes he's trapped, will try to burn the evidence. He thinks he's playing a game of chess, but he doesn't realize the board has already been flipped." She led Cassie toward the clerk's office, but her mind was already miles away, calculating the weight of the transcript. She knew Bradford would spend the next hour in his chambers, frantically calling his golfing buddies and the predatory landlords he protected, trying to find a way to bury the afternoon's events. He would try to frame it as a misunderstanding, a heated moment of judicial discretion. But Karla knew better. She knew that the transcript wasn't just words, it was the key to the safe. By insulting her intellectual capacity, Bradford hadn't just been rude, he had demonstrated a fundamental bias and a lack of judicial temperament that triggered an automatic, high-level review of every single ruling he had made in the last decade. As they reached the clerk's window, Karla saw the local news van pulling into the courthouse lot. The intellectual capacity transcript was already leaking through the legal community like water through a cracked dam. The predator wasn't just being hunted, he was being televised. And for Judge Bradford, the realization was finally sinking in. The woman he tried to bury didn't just run the bar association, she was about to become the architect of his extinction. The clerk's office of the Hamilton County Courthouse was a place of beige filing cabinets and the rhythmic, soul-crushing hum of industrial printers, a graveyard for hope where bureaucracy went to die. At 4:15 p.m., the atmosphere was sluggish, the staff already mentally clocking out, until the heavy double doors were nudged open by two men in delivery jumpsuits. They weren't carrying legal briefs, they were hauling heavy-duty hand trucks stacked with reinforced canvas bags that clinked with a dull, heavy resonance. Behind them walked Karla Reed. She had traded her navy blazer for the rolled-up sleeves of her silk blouse, but her preternatural calm remained intact, her gaze as sharp as a diamond. Cassie Reed followed closely behind, her eyes wide as she watched the delivery men navigate toward the high wooden counter of the fines and restitution window. The clerk, a woman named Martha who had spent 30 years watching the desperate and the defeated pass through her line, looked up over her reading glasses. "Can I help you, Ms. Reed?" Karla said, her voice smooth and carrying across the quiet room. "I'm here to satisfy a contempt fine issued by Judge Bradford in Courtroom 4B. $5,000, payable immediately." Martha blinked, looking at the mountain of canvas bags now sitting on her counter. $5,000? And how exactly are you paying that, honey? We take certified checks or money orders. Actually, Karla said, leaning against the counter with a slight, knowing smirk, per the County Judicial Code, Section 8B, the clerk's office is required to accept all legal tender of the United States for the satisfaction of court-ordered debts. And as the president of the State Bar, I'm sure you'll find my adherence to the letter of the law quite thorough. She reached out and untied the drawstring of the top bag. A literal river of copper and nickels spilled out onto the counter, pennies, nickels, and dimes, thousands of them, unrolled and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sound was like a localized hailstorm. Clerks from the back offices poked their heads out, a few deputies standing by the metal detectors wandered over, their expressions shifting from confusion to suppressed amusement. This wasn't just a payment, it was a performance of a malicious compliance. By paying in loose change, Karla wasn't just satisfying a debt, she was forcing the court's administrative machinery to grind to a halt to process it. "You want me to count this?" Martha asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "I expect a line-item receipt, Martha," Karla replied gently. "And since Judge Bradford insisted the fine be paid before the close of business or face further sanctions, I suggest we get started. I have all evening." As Martha began the painstaking process of dumping the coins into the counting machines, which promptly jammed under the sheer volume of metal, Karla pulled out her phone. She wasn't looking at the coins. She was watching the live feed from a local news site. The headline was already trending, Bar Association President fined by King Bradford. The optics were devastating. While the counting machines whirred and spat out errors, the lobby began to fill with people. Not just lawyers, but the very people Bradford had spent years stepping on. They stood in the back of the room, watching the woman in the navy suit stand her ground with a mountain of copper. One of the delivery men leaned over to Karla. "That's the last of the nickels, ma'am. You want the pennies on the counter or the floor?" "The counter is fine," Karla said, her eyes never leaving the clerk's window. "We want everything to be perfectly visible." Every clink of a coin was a heartbeat in the countdown of Bradford's career. Karla knew that upstairs in his chambers, the judge was likely watching this very scene on the internal security monitors. She wanted him to see the physical weight of his arrogance. She wanted him to understand that for every cent he had squeezed out of the poor and the unprotected, there was a debt that was finally coming due. The hard karma of the situation was starting to settle over the courthouse like a heavy fog. As the clock ticked toward 5 p.m., and the total reached only $1,200, Karla simply pulled up a chair. She wasn't going anywhere. She was the storm that had finally arrived at the king's gates, and she was going to make sure he felt every single penny of the impact. The moon hung low over the manicured hedges of the Pinehurst estate, casting long, skeletal shadows across the stone driveway of Judge Bradford's private residence. Inside the house, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the frantic, hushed tones of a man who knew the walls were closing in. Bradford sat in his darkened study, his trembling hand hovering over the telephone, but he was no longer the king of Courtroom 4B. He was a man waiting for a ghost to knock. The knock, when it came, wasn't a knock at all. It was the synchronized, heavy thud of tactical boots on his front porch and the blinding flash of high-intensity searchlights bleeding through his heavy velvet curtains. "Search warrant. FBI. Open the door." The voice that boomed through the megaphone was steady, clinical, and entirely devoid of the heat Bradford usually employed to intimidate his subjects. As the front door was breached with a single, professional strike, a team of agents in windbreakers flooded the foyer. Leading them was a man who moved with the quiet authority of someone who had dismantled cartels and shadow governments alike. David Sterling, Karla's husband and a director within the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit, stepped into the study. David didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a surgeon arriving for a difficult but necessary procedure. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a tactical watch that glinted in the dim light. Behind him, agents began the methodical process of tagging electronics and filing cabinets, but David's eyes were fixed on the floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves behind Bradford's desk. "David," Bradford stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to stand. "This is an outrage. We've played golf together. I've known your family for..." "You've known my wife's family for a long time, Bradford," David interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Long enough to know what you did to her Uncle Caleb. But we're not here for small talk tonight. We're here for the ledger." Bradford's face went from ashen to a ghostly, translucent white. "I don't know what you're talking about. There is no ledger." David didn't argue. He walked to the bookshelf, his fingers trailing over the spines of leather-bound law books until he reached a specific, unremarkable volume on civil procedure. With a firm tug, a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a recessed wall safe. It wasn't a standard dial lock. It was a state-of-the-art biometric scanner, a glowing blue eye that required a fingerprint and a retinal scan to yield its secrets. "It's military grade," Bradford sneered, a final, pathetic flicker of his old arrogance returning. "You'll need a court order for my biometrics, and by the time you get a judge to sign off on that, the sun will be up and my lawyers will have stayed this entire circus." "I don't need your finger, Bradford," David said, reaching into a small Pelican case held by a forensic technician. He pulled out a device that looked like a sleek, oversized tablet connected to a series of fiber optic leads. "And I certainly don't need your permission. You see, the Bureau has been tracking the software signatures of these black market safes for months. We call this the scalpel. It doesn't break the lock, it simply convinces the lock that it's already been opened. The room went silent as David applied a haptic pad to the scanner. For 30 seconds, the only sound was the high-pitched whine of the device cycling through millions of encrypted algorithms. Bradford watched, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the arms of his leather chair until his knuckles turned white. Then came the sound. A soft, mechanical clunk, the sound of a kingdom falling. The heavy steel door of the safe swung open on silent hinges. David reached inside, ignoring the stacks of rubber-banded $100 bills and the high-end watches. He reached for a single, battered black notebook hidden in the very back. On the cover, in faded gold foil, were the words, Project Legacy. David flipped the book open. His eyes scanned the columns of names, dates, and dollar amounts. He saw the names of landlords, developers, and even other public officials. But his thumb stopped on a page dated 15 years prior, a page that detailed the systematic seizure of a small family hardware business and the subsequent consulting fees paid into a shell account. Uncle Caleb, David whispered, more to himself than to the room. He looked up at Bradford, who had collapsed back into his chair, his eyes glazed and vacant. The intellectual capacity that Bradford had mocked in Karla had been his undoing, but it was David's precision that had finally removed the tumor from the heart of the county. "Tag it," David commanded his team, his voice cold as ice. "And get the transport ready. The judge is going for a ride." As they led Bradford out in handcuffs, past the neighbors who had gathered on their lawns to watch the fall of the Hamilton County Titan, David pulled out his phone. He dialed Karla. She answered on the first ring. "We have it," David said, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect in the dark windows of the estate. "We have the legacy. It's all over, Karla. The light is coming back." The interior of the FBI's Mobile Command Unit was a sharp, clinical contrast to the opulence of Bradford's estate. Under the hum of high-end cooling fans and the glow of dual monitors, Karla sat across from David, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee that she hadn't touched. Between them lay the Project Legacy ledger, its battered black cover looking small and unassuming for an object that held the weight of so many broken lives. David flipped the pages with the practiced care of a man handling live ordnance. "The financial trail starts in the late 90s, he said, his voice low and steady. "It wasn't just bribes for favorable rulings, Karla. It was a vertically integrated racketeering scheme. Bradford would identify small businesses with high equity and low debt, then use his bench to create legal emergencies, zoning violations, sudden lien foreclosures, or manufactured contract disputes." Karla leaned forward, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. She saw the names of local developers who had purchased the seized properties for pennies on the dollar, followed by commission payments back to a shell company Bradford controlled. Then, her breath hitched. Page 42. Dated July 14, 2008. In Bradford's precise, arrogant script, there it was, C. Reed, Reed's Hardware and Supply. Settlement finalized. Asset liquidation complete. The memories hit Karla with the force of a physical blow. She was 21 again, standing in the dust-choked parking lot of her Uncle Caleb's store, watching as men in cheap suits slapped, seized, notices on the glass doors. She remembered Caleb, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the smell of cedar and motor oil, sitting on his porch, looking at a stack of court documents he couldn't make sense of. He had built that business over 30 years, a cornerstone of the neighborhood where every kid got their first summer job and every neighbor got credit on a handshake. "He told us it was a clerical error at the bank," Karla whispered, her finger tracing the name C. Reed. Caleb spent his last dime on a lawyer who told him the judge's ruling was unusual but ironclad. That lawyer's name is in here too, isn't it? David nodded grimly, flipping back to the index. Yeah. Martin Vance. He was on Bradford's payroll. He wasn't defending your uncle, he was leading him to the slaughter. Bradford used a manufactured tax lien to force a flash sale. The buyer was Gregory Plimpton's father. They flipped the land to a shopping mall developer 3 months later for a $4 million profit. Karla stood up, walking to the small, reinforced window of the van. Outside, she could see Bradford being loaded into the transport vehicle, his silhouette slumped and defeated. For 15 years, her family had carried the shame of that failure. Caleb had died believing he had simply been too slow for a fast-moving world, his heart giving out less than a year after the store was razed. It wasn't a failure, Karla said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and a cold, diamond-hard resolve. It was a hit. The ghost of Caleb wasn't just a memory anymore, he was a witness. Every entry in that book represented a version of Caleb's story, a father who lost his farm, a widow who lost her home, a young entrepreneur whose dreams were strangled in their crib by a man who sold the law to the highest bidder. She turned back to David, her face illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. The preternatural calm she had displayed in the courtroom was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous, a sense of absolute purpose. He called me a burden to the taxpayers, she said, a small, grim smile appearing on her lips. He has no idea what the bill is going to look like when I'm finished with him. We don't just prosecute him for the bribes, David. We bring back every single family he buried. We make the legacy mean something else. David reached out, taking her hand. Where do we start? With the man who bought the land, Karla replied, her eyes returning to the ledger. Gregory Plimpton. If Bradford is the architect, Plimpton is the contractor. And I think it's time we offer the contractor a deal he can't refuse. The interrogation room was a sterile, windowless box that smelled of industrial cleaner and the cold sweat of a man who had finally realized his money couldn't buy him an exit. Gregory Plimpton sat at the metal table, his expensive silk tie loosened and his face a mottled shade of gray. He looked less like the titan of real estate who had terrorized the county's tenants and more like a cornered animal watching the light fade from the forest. Across from him, Karla Reed sat with her hands folded, her navy suit still immaculate despite the late hour. She didn't need to shout, the Project Legacy ledger sat on the table between them, its presence more intimidating than any weapon David's team could have brandished. Gregory, Karla said, her voice a calm, dangerous melody. We've spent the last 3 hours cataloging the shell companies. The offshore accounts. The consulting fees paid to Judge Bradford's wife. My husband is currently processing your father's old records, the ones involving my Uncle Caleb's hardware store. Plimpton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was just following the legal process, Karla. My father bought those properties at public auction. Everything was above board. Bradford signed the orders. If the law was on our side, how can you call it a crime? Because the law wasn't on your side, Gregory. The law was in your pocket, Karla replied, leaning forward until she was inches from his face. And now that pocket has a hole in it. Bradford is currently being processed at the federal holding facility. He's already trying to claim that you were the mastermind, that you coerced him into these rulings with threats of exposing his gambling debts. He's painting you as the predator and himself as the victim. That was the spark. Plimpton's eyes widened, the loyalty of the golfing buddies evaporating in an instant. The shadow government they had built was a house of cards, and the wind was picking up. That lying, robed snake. He came to me. He told me which properties were vulnerable. He's the one who suggested the manufactured tax liens. I have the emails, Karla. I kept them all in a private server because I knew one day he'd try to pull this. Emails? Karla asked, her knowing smirk returning. That's a very interesting development, Gregory. Because right now, the FBI is looking for a reason not to seize every single one of your apartment complexes as proceeds of a criminal enterprise. They're looking for a reason to let you walk out of here with your freedom, even if you lose your fortune. Plimpton leaned in, his voice a frantic whisper. I'll give you everything. Not just the emails. I have the recordings. Bradford liked to brag after a few drinks. He talked about how he'd cleansed the county of the people he didn't like. He talked about your uncle specifically, how he enjoyed watching a proud man beg for a stay of execution. Karla felt a cold shiver of rage move through her, but she kept her face a mask of professional detachment. This was the betrayal she had been waiting for. The architect and the contractor were tearing each other apart, and all she had to do was provide the room. If you want the deal, Gregory, you need to be the first one to sign, Karla said, pushing a cooperation agreement across the cold steel table. You give us the server. You testify against Bradford in open court. You tell the world exactly how the king sold his kingdom for a kickback. Plimpton didn't hesitate. He grabbed the pen with a trembling hand and scrawled his name at the bottom of the document. He was no longer a landlord, he was the state's star witness, and the final nail in Judge Bradford's coffin. As Karla walked out of the interrogation room, she found David waiting in the hallway. He looked at the signed paper and then at his wife. He broke? He didn't just break, Karla said, her heels clicking against the linoleum as they headed toward the exit. He shattered. He's giving us the server. He's giving us the recordings. Bradford wanted a legacy? Well, he's about to get one. He's going to be the most famous inmate in the federal system. The night air was cool as they stepped out of the building. For the first time in 15 years, the weight on Karla's shoulders felt lighter. The sterling light was no longer just a hope, it was an approaching dawn. The man who had tried to bury her for her intellectual capacity was about to learn that the smartest person in the room is the one who knows how to make the wolves turn on each other. The transformation of Courtroom 4B was not measured in paint or furniture, but in the heavy, electric atmosphere of a reckoning. The morning sun, usually so harsh and clinical, now slanted through the high windows in golden bars, illuminating a scene that would have been unthinkable only 48 hours prior. Judge Bradford was absent from his high mahogany perch. Instead, he sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his hands shackled to his belt. He looked small, a man stripped of the black-robed armor that had once made him feel like a god. But the true change lay in the gallery. The pews were no longer occupied by a few scattered, fearful individuals. They were packed. This was the gallery of victims, a sea of faces representing 15 years of systemic theft. There was Abigail Henderson, an elderly woman who had lost her family's floral shop to a manufactured zoning violation. There was Derek Walsh, a veteran whose veteran-owned plumbing business had been bled dry by consulting fees he couldn't afford. There were dozens of others, people who had once walked out of this room with their heads bowed in shame, now standing tall, their eyes fixed on the man who had tried to erase them. Karla Reed stood at the center of it all. She was no longer just Ms. E. Reed, counsel. She was the conductor of a symphony of justice. As she moved toward the podium, the rustle of the crowd died down into a silence so profound it felt like a prayer. She didn't look at the new presiding judge immediately. She turned and looked at the gallery, acknowledging the unheard people with a slow, solemn nod. Today is not just about a violation of the judicial code, Karla began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the very back of the room. It is about the reclamation of a house. For over a decade, this room was used to dismantle lives, to silence the vulnerable, and to treat the law as a retail transaction for the powerful. But the law does not belong to the man in the robe. It belongs to the people who trust it to protect them. She gestured toward Abigail. "Mrs. Henderson, would you please stand?" As the elderly woman rose, her hands trembling slightly on her cane, Karla didn't ask her for a legal argument. She asked her for her story. One by one, the victims spoke. They didn't speak of statutes or precedents, they spoke of the night they had to tell their children they were moving. They spoke of the shame of bankruptcy and the heartbreak of watching a life's work being sold for a kickback. Bradford tried to look away, his eyes darting toward the floor, but the weight of their collective gaze was an anchor he couldn't lift. Every word from the gallery was a mirror held up to his soul. The intellectual capacity he had mocked in Karla was now being used to meticulously rebuild the lives he had shattered. "Your Honor," Karla said, turning finally to the bench, her preternatural calm returning, but with a new, sharp edge of righteous indignation. "The defense will argue that these were separate civil matters. But the Project Legacy Ledger tells a different story. It tells the story of a predator who saw a community as a harvest. These people are not just statistics in a file. They are the light that Judge Bradford tried to blow out." The atmosphere in the room shifted from grief to a quiet, burning triumph. The gallery wasn't just watching a trial, they were participating in a resurrection. The unheard were finally speaking, and for the first time in 15 years, the walls of Courtroom 4B were listening. Karla watched as Cassie Reed, sitting in the front row, reached out and took Abigail Henderson's hand. It was a small gesture, but it signaled the end of Bradford's reign. The predator was no longer just caught, he was being dismantled by the very people he had deemed insignificant. The air in Courtroom 4B felt different now, lighter, as if the very molecules of the room had been scrubbed of a decade's worth of stagnant oppression. Judge Blackwell, a woman known for a gaze that could peel paint and a literal interpretation of the word justice, sat where Bradford once reigned. Below her, the man who had once called himself the king of Hamilton County looked like a discarded shadow. Bradford's expensive suit was wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt, and the arrogance that had once fueled his outbursts had been replaced by a hollow, flickering desperation. Karla Reed stood at the prosecutor's table, her hands resting lightly on the cool wood. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room, the silence was her ally. Behind her, the gallery was a living wall of the lives Bradford had attempted to bulldoze. Every breath from the pews seemed to sync with the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a countdown to a debt that was finally being called. "The defendant speaks of judicial discretion," Karla said, her voice cutting through the room with a clinical, lethal precision. "He speaks of the difficulties of the bench. But the Project Legacy Ledger doesn't speak of difficulty. It speaks of a harvest. It tracks the exact moment a public servant decided that a single mother's home was a line item on a balance sheet. It records the precise day he traded the integrity of the law for a kickback from a predatory landlord." She turned slightly, her eyes locking onto Bradford's. He tried to meet her gaze, to summon one last spark of the fire that had once terrified the county, but he found only the cold, unyielding reflection of his own crimes. "Judge Bradford looked at me and saw a lack of intellectual capacity," Karla continued, her knowing smirk returning for a fleeting, sharp second. "But what he truly failed to understand was that the law isn't a weapon for the powerful, it's a shield for the weak. He didn't just break the rules. He broke the heart of this community. And for that, there is no discount." Judge Blackwell leaned forward, her robes pooling around her like a dark tide. She looked down at the sentencing guidelines and then at the man in the shackles. "Mr. Bradford," she began, her voice echoing with a gravity that made the gallery hold its collective breath. You have spent 15 years treating this bench like a private ATM and this courtroom like a theater of cruelty. You didn't just steal money, you stole time. You stole the security of families and the legacies of honest men like Karla Reed. Bradford opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one last hollow apology or a plea for leniency, but Blackwell raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. The court finds that your actions represent a systematic betrayal of the public trust that borders on the absolute. Therefore, I am departing from the standard recommendations. A ripple of electricity moved through the pews. Cassie Reed gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles white. On the counts of racketeering, bribery, and judicial misconduct, Blackwell's voice rang out, I sentence you to the maximum term allowed by law, 25 years in a federal facility. No possibility of parole. Furthermore, every asset identified in the Project Legacy investigation, your estate, your accounts, and your shell companies, is hereby seized for the creation of a restitution fund for the victims of this court. The gavel didn't just strike the block, it sounded like a door slamming shut on an era of darkness. The 25-year harvest had begun, but it wasn't the one Bradford had planned. Instead of wealth and power, he was harvesting the consequences of every life he had ever tried to bury. As the bailiff stepped forward to lead him away, the gallery didn't erupt in cheers. They stood in a profound, dignified silence, watching as the man who had once been their executioner was led through the side door, his head finally bowed. Karla stood still, watching the door close. The preternatural calm was still there, but as she looked back at the faces of Abigail, Derek, and Cassie, a new light took hold, a quiet, triumphant glow. The predator was gone, and the harvest of justice had finally come home. The Hamilton County Courthouse Square was no longer the gray, oppressive space it had once been. On this crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after the nuclear strike, in Courtroom 4B, the air felt scrubbed clean. A crowd had gathered not for a trial, but for a ribbon cutting, the official opening of the Sterling Justice Foundation, headquartered in a refurbished building that had once been one of Gregory Plimpton's predatory holdings. Karla Reed stood at the podium, her navy suit catching the morning sun. Beside her stood David, his hand resting supportively on her shoulder, and Derek Walsh, who wore his dress blues with a quiet, reclaimed pride. But the guest of honor was Cassie Reed. She wasn't the trembling, evicted mother from a year ago. She stood tall, her eyes clear and her head held high. For too long, the law in this county was used as a shovel to bury the dreams of the hard-working, Karla began, her voice carrying across the plaza with a resonant, peaceful authority. Today, we use the very assets that were stolen from this community to build a foundation that can never be shaken. The Sterling Light isn't just a name on a building, it's a promise that no one in this city will ever have to face a king alone again. As the applause swelled, Karla reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out a gold-embossed card or a legal motion. She pulled out a set of brass keys attached to a simple, sturdy keychain. She turned to Cassie, whose breath hitched as she realized what was happening. Cassie, Karla said softly, her preternatural calm giving way to a warm, triumphant smile. The court has finalized the restitution. This isn't a rental, and there are no hardship clauses. This is the deed and the keys to the house on Elm Street, the one that was wrongfully taken from your family 2 generations ago. It's back in the Reed name. It's home. As Cassie took the keys, her fingers trembling with a joy that defied words, the crowd erupted. It was a sound of healing, a collective exhale from a community that had spent 15 years holding its breath. Derek Walsh stepped forward, pressing a small, tarnished silver coin into Karla's hand, the same challenge coin his grandfather had carried. My grandfather used to say that some people are born to carry the light, he whispered. Thank you for bringing it back to us, President Reed. Karla gripped the coin tight, feeling the cold metal against her palm. She looked up at the courthouse, where the windows of Courtroom 4B glinted in the light. The predator was behind bars, the ledger was closed, and the hard karma of Judge Bradford had become a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the state capitol. The black woman Bradford had tried to bury for her lack of intellectual capacity had instead become the architect of a new era. As the festivities continued, Karla adjusted her blazer and looked toward the horizon. The long Tuesday was finally over, the ghosts of Uncle Caleb and the thousands like him were finally at peace, and for the first time in 15 years, the light in Hamilton County was here to stay. She turned away from the courthouse and began to walk, not as a hunter or a leader, but as a woman who had simply, finally, seen justice done.